Welcome to our EEX informational video about the latest changes in the EU ETS. This episode covers the EU ETS as it relates to the maritime industry. This is one of a four-part series that covers major changes and updates to help impacted industry players chart a strategic, successful, and sustainable implementation for their business. The format of these videos is an informal fireside chat between our in-house EEX experts and industry leaders. I'm Athena, a Senior Public Relations Officer at EEX with a focus on sustainability and environmental markets. Today, I'm joined by Tjard Jürgens from Zeaborn Ship Management and my colleague Ellen de Vocht. Tjard Jürgens is a Senior Vice President of Business Development at Zeaborn Ship Management. Over recent months, he has spent considerable time together with a larger team on gearing Zeaborn up for the upcoming EU ETS regulations. And Ellen is a Senior Public and Regulatory Affairs Advisor at EEX. Based in our office in Brussels, she provides expertise on policy and regulation related to European and international carbon pricing and is focused closely on the EU ETS review process. So with that, let's get right into the discussion. Ellen, could you set us up with a quick overview of the EU ETS policy for the maritime industry?
Yeah, thanks a lot for the introduction, Athena. Of course, happy to kick this conversation off. Of course, it's a very timely conversation as we have been discussing the inclusion of the sector in the EU ETS concretely already since the very first proposals came out in July 2021. And we have now finally seen the final votes to actually bring this into practice. So I just want to kick off this conversation with three main aspects according to which this will happen. First of all, maybe most important, the maritime inclusion in the EU ETS will take effect as of 2024, which will be the first compliance year for which companies will have to surrender allowances in 2025. So compliance will gradually phase in between 2024 and 26, but as of the start, all allowances will be auctioned. So there will be no free allocation to this sector. Second, in terms of geographical scope, 100% of intra-European emissions will be covered, and 50% of all voyages either starting from or arriving at an EU port will be covered as well. So this gives it a really clear international dimension. Third, in terms of scope of vessels, also quite important, there's a clear link to the MRV regulation. As a general rule, ships above 5,000 gross tonnage will be included, regardless of the flag they fly. So this may even be expanded over time. So to summarize, starting with these three aspects, they really have as common denominator that the EU has opted for a very ambitious inclusion of this sector, both in scope, in timeline, and independence on auctions as an allocation method from the very start.
So thank you, Ellen, for that great summary. And this is the decision regarding the regulations now, but there have been changes throughout. And at this point, I would want to see what your opinions are, Tjard. What are the features that have stood out to you with regards to this final decision?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for having me again on this now video webcast after we did the podcast a couple of months ago. A lot has happened since, like you said, so thanks for the introduction. I think in terms of changes, not a lot have stood out compared to what has previously been discussed, but I think for us as an industry, the predominant factor is the difference between EU ETS, the emission trading scheme of the European Union, and what the International Maritime Organization has in store. So for those not familiar with the maritime industry, the IMO, International Maritime Organization, is part of the United Nations, and they basically are the governing body for the entire maritime industry globally. And they have obviously also set out their own sets of rules and regulations to decarbonize shipping. And I think the major difference is between the European Union's approach and the IMO's approach is that the European Union really monitorizes and incentivizes those shipping companies who proactively decarbonize their assets. So the fewer emissions you blow out into the world, the higher competitive advantage you have. because it's directly linked to these carbon credits that you have to buy. So, one emission equals a carbon credit. And you can sort of then level out how much that's going to cost you. Whereas the IMO's approach is fairly different. There is no monetary incentive, no directly monetary incentive as such to decarbonize. Based on the productivity of your vessel, if it's more productive, if it has lesser emissions, if it carries more cargo throughout a longer period of time, you get a certain rating of your ship. If you drop below a certain threshold, you'll be penalized and you have to put measures in place to climb up the ladder again. But there is no direct monetary impact on that. The only real impact is that you have is the tradability of the ship. So the better the rating, the better that is. And I think that's the biggest difference between those two. And personally, I welcome the European Union's approach most because it has a direct impact and a direct grip on decarbonizing shipping.
So thank you for that, Tjard. I think that was a really good comparison because we don't often have key moments in time, I think, where we can really look at policy and how they come together to impact companies as they're implementing solutions for that. And at this point, I want to invite you, Ellen, to maybe go into some of the policy details for the EU ETS as it pertains to the maritime. I know you've gone through some of the broad strokes like key dates and scope and such. But yeah, just to go over them and then to see what seems clear to Tjard and those in the industry and what might still have some open questions.
Yeah, thanks, Athena, and thanks also to you, Tjard, for this indeed very interesting comparison. I think this whole nature of this sector as a truly the global sector included in a European scheme has been a really important one during the discussions as well, and also during the final outcome. So it's also fascinating to exactly understand the different routes these different organizations have taken. It's also actually mentioned in the final agreement, in the directive, that there is a broad support for a global market-based measure by the IMO should this be decided in an international context. Because of course, in an ideal world, one carbon price is applied to a global sector and everyone in this global sector. And that's also recognized by the directive. But indeed, you make a good comparison there. Then it should be a decision by the IMO to actually have a carbon price and a market-based measure. So yeah, let's see, maybe in the years to come, something might move there. But in the meantime, of course, whilst the addition in terms of tons of emissions added to the EU ETS might not be the largest impact to the EU ETS itself, this European directive does have a large impact on the sector. And as any sector, we assume there will be a process to figure out exactly the structure of this market and how compliance and participation will look like. One aspect of the agreement, which might be important for this one and which we have not yet covered, but was actually quite prominent in the debates from the start to evidence this complexity, is the point of compliance and which entity in this very complex value chain of maritime emissions will be covered directly by the directive, and how exactly the polluter pays principle can be most effectively applied. So in the end, it has been decided that the entity called the shipping company will be responsible, which is foremost defined as a ship owner. However, since these are often not the ones actually making the final shots about the fuels or the operation of the ship, they will be entitled under national law to claim reimbursement from the entity that is responsible for these decisions. This will not affect the compliance obligations of the shipping company, who will be responsible to surrender ETS credits for each ton of CO2 that is reported, but it may, of course, affect how this market will structure itself. So that's just one more detailed aspect, which was quite prominent in discussions about how to apply this new agreement practically. But yeah, Tjard, it's very interesting also to, of course, hear from your perspective, which other notes may or may not be clear at this point.
I think that generally speaking, on behalf, if you don't mind, on behalf of the shipping industry, it's pretty clear to most companies anyways that in terms of the timeline that is set out, in terms of the staggered phased-in approach that is set out, in terms of how the market roughly works, that it's capped, that there is going to be a higher supply and a lower demand in the foreseeable future, that there's only one way where the price can go. So I think the generics are pretty well known now in the maritime industry. However, what I do think is still a big question to many companies is how do they get access to the market? How can they probably trade themselves? How can they work with others, third parties? How can they make sure that they actually, at the end of the day, comply? And I think this is interesting, perhaps where EEX, you guys can share a little bit of intel on that.
So yeah, that's first of all a positive thing to hear, that actually most of these agreements and how the ETS works is quite clear and quite transparent already. Also something where we've been trying to put quite an effort in some of the podcasts, for example, where you were priorly invited as well. But true, like the next big step is actually how are they going to arrange this compliance and how are they going to access these markets? So talking from an EX perspective, there's definitely a number of different ways to do this. For different parts of the market, which are targeted at organizations of different sizes, different types as well, and with different needs of coming into the ETS, also depending on whether these companies have a very large exposure or rather, which means they might want to very actively hedge their price risks or more small. So these really range from the simplest access levels in the primary auctions only to full membership of the primary auctions, but also the secondary and the futures markets by themselves to trade directly. But of course, we also work with many intermediaries, which we can only assume they will play a very important role for this new sector as well, as they do already for several other sectors. Especially for smaller companies, it might not make sense for them to directly access or directly and actively trade themselves, but they might depend on intermediaries to do so on their behalf or to apply certain services there. So what we imagine is an extended network of access for organizations which do or do not have the scale, expertise, need, wish to access the market directly themselves or to outsource this to a third party. So that's something that we are looking into together with the market, but also in these conversations, which is useful for us to get the feedback in order to ensure that this is set up in the most efficient way.
So thank you for that, Ellen. I think that was a pretty clear answer as to how market participants can participate directly or indirectly, but most importantly in the most efficient way, I think, for their businesses and their ends while remaining compliant. And I think at this point, it's a really good opportunity for you, Tjard, to share your experience in a company that does shipping management. How has Zeaborn prioritized given these changes? And what are the recommendations that Zeaborn could give as a manager for smaller companies for compliance?
Yes, so maybe before I explain our process and the priorities that we've set out, perhaps it makes sense that I share 2-3 sentences about our business model to put everything a little bit into perspective. So Zeaborn Ship Management, we are a third-party ship management company. What does that mean? Someone else owns a ship. There can be another shipping company, there can be PE money, there can be institutional investors, whatever have you. And they've appointed us to manage their asset from a technical point of view, commercially perhaps, with crewing to insure the vessel and so on and so forth. In the real estate, you would have a facility manager. And that is us just in the shipping space. So we collect and know all the data of the vessel on behalf of our clients, the ship owners at the end of the day. And when the regulations for the European trading scheme, emission trading scheme came up, and at the same time the discussions on IMO level, International Maritime Organizations, were happening, we decided as a company that we should develop a service product for our customers around these topics to help them navigate through the process and to help them navigate through the legislations. So what we did is we hired a team of vessel performance managers, and I think that's the first priority that one has to set. We talked about this in the podcast already, so I'm going to make it just very brief. But essentially, what you have to do as a shipping company is you have to get your data right. You have to get the correct data from the ships into your system, into your database, and be able to analyze that and check that. We've been doing this for a couple of years, not just us, but maritime in general. We were required by law under European Union to submit our data. However, the implications of erroneous data wasn't there. It was more statistical. So now that we come into a time frame where it is very relevant to have accurate data, not just legally speaking, but also commercially speaking. Just as an example, if you have too many emission data recorded because of erroneous input, you wind up paying way too much than you should be. And this obviously has a commercial impact. So that's the first priority, get your data right. And you can do that by investing into software, investing into flow meters, sensors, reading devices on board your ship to get the data off the vessel into your system. So that was the first thing that we do, and that's something that we're still continuously doing. And then I think, but that's just the sort of presetting that you have to have. The other priorities that you have to sort out is you have to wrap your head around your strategy. So we asked ourselves a question, do we want to actually actively participate in the market? And the answer was very quickly no. And I can also explain why. First of all, we're a shipping company, not a financial institution, so we do not have the expertise to trade. And the second thing is that because we do not own the assets, the ships, but we're doing it on behalf of someone else, for us it's just a sort of last resort because we're legally compelled to submit the emission certificates. For us, it's the last resort to proactively trade. So that is something that one has to, for everyone, every company themselves has to make clear. And then I think you have to go through the steps. So for us, we then had a discussion whether or not we should open up a GHG account already with the legislation applicable to us, which is a whole nother topic. And we decided that right now or a couple of months ago is not the right timing because you could only set up a trading account for competitive trading, but the accounts for the compliance market, you can only set up, I think it is in April or May. You can start the process and then it takes 1 or 2 months. So considering that it takes 1 or 2 months, keep that in mind because the deadline to submit your emission allowances is in end of Q1 in the next in 2025. So that's something that people have to realize, and the price is only going up. So my recommendation for everyone is to open up your accounts, the compliance accounts, as soon as possible, at least, if not the trading accounts. And the other thing is, do have a look if you have foreign entities outside of the European Union. For us, we do, for example, have a ship management company in Singapore. And there are certain regulatory rules where foreign entities have to register their GHG account. It basically goes along the line of where you're trading the most, in which legislative area and which country. So for us, example, if the Singapore entity is trading mostly to Portugal, it would be in Portugal. But these lists will only be published, I think it is end of February next year. So you might want to get ahead of that, have your data collected, perhaps have a conversation with one of the country's administrative government bodies, and sort out where you want to register. So I think that's the third priority. And then the last one, to finish it off, to make it short, find somebody you can trade with. Find a broker, find a trader you feel comfortable with, and have conversations with them so that you can access the market through EEX, for example.
Thank you, Tjard, for that. I think those tips were extremely concrete, very clear to me, and I'm not even from the industry, so thank you for that. And I wanted to bring us all back. At the end of the day, I imagine many of the people who are listening to this are trying to juggle lots of components. I heard a very clear message that it's about collecting good data, getting ahead, getting registered. And I feel like a lot of people might feel that this is additional admin. This is an additional burden. And so as a last thought to round out the conversations, what opportunities do you see created by this new compliance component for the industry? And maybe I'll start with you, Ellen.
Yeah, of course. And thanks indeed for these very concrete tips and steps to take for the industry. I think that's really exactly what everyone in this sector needs right now. And absolutely, the union registry as another critical piece of infrastructure for the ETS is something very important that everyone will need to figure out as well. So if you ask me, Athena, to kind of sum up opportunities on a positive note, I think the one thing that I can only think about is that above all, it's a tremendous positive sign that the EU is giving here, that putting a price on carbon matters in all sectors. It's the very first jurisdiction that has put an explicit price on carbon on emissions from the maritime sector. So whilst this may mean that there will be a learning curve for the sector and for this market at large on how to handle this and how to approach compliance, it's a very positive sign also to institutions like the IMO on how to do this. There's also a lot of aspects which we have not even covered in this episode. I think we could have talked for hours about this specific topic, but we're here at EEX as well, and we want to continue supporting this sector as they move towards their implementation.
I think the advantage, or the big advantage of the EU ETS is quite obvious. If you handle it well, if you proactively decarbonize, but even if you just have your processes properly figured out, you can have an absolute commercial advantage over your competitors. Plain and simple. And I think that's the biggest reason for the EU ETS, because it will proactively incentivize what I said at the beginning, decarbonization.
Thank you to Tjard for sharing your thoughts, and also, of course, to you, Ellen. They were both very detailed, but also very succinct and accessible. And that's it for today. Thank you to both of you. And to those of you in the audience, if you enjoyed this episode, have a look at our other episodes on the EU ETS.